The year is 1303 and you, like many others, have arrived in Constantinople. 100 years ago the Crusaders had captured the city and ransacked it, but now the Greeks are back in control thanks to Michael VIII Palaiologos. Now the emperors are actually trying to bring back the glory of this plundered city, but they still also have to contend with nature, as earthquakes continue to add further damage. In fact, there was a powerful earthquake earlier this year, and the decade before, and even the decade before that. Yet you've still arrived in possibly the most famous city in the world, the capital of the Roman Empire. But don't expect just to meet Greeks here. You see, the Palaiologos dynasty is determined to reclaim lost possessions and has employed mercenaries from around the world. So you'll see Catalonian knights alongside Turkic horsemen, plus an army of 30,000 Mongols on mustering, ready to reconquer that land from the Ottomans. There's also Serbians, Georgians, Armenians and Albanian heavy cavalrymen, some Bulgarian horse archers, and the Russians have always sent some troops as a sign of friendship to their fellow Orthodox nation. Plus 10,000 Alans have arrived from the north a couple years ago, and they'll join the established number of Venetians, Franks, Genoese, Germans and even former Crusaders filling in the ranks, either as knights on ships or using the latest crossbows. Now there is a long history of the city employing mercenaries like the famous Viking Varangian Guards. These Vikings actually had their own settlement about 20 kilometers west of here in Bathonia. But ever since the Normans invaded England, their ranks were primarily made up of Anglo-Saxons who fled. So by now they're actually called Anglo-Varangians, but they still wield a great axe and act as the emperor's bodyguard. In fact, they'd served the emperor so well that they were granted land on the Black Sea and they created a colony called New England. But these are the most loyal of the mercenaries. As for the others, like the Catalan Company for instance, they would soon pillage Greek settlements in Anatolia, forcing the emperor to send the Alans to fight against them. However, this is far from the only problem within the city. The empire has essentially handed away the control of trade over to the Genoese and Venetians, as well as giving them their own quarters. And you're arriving just at the end of a war with Venice, which began when Genoese attacked the Venetian quarter and massacred the inhabitants. The Venetians responded by sailing to the Prince's Islands and flogging the population right in front of the citizens of Constantinople. The population on Prince's Islands, by the way, would have also included many refugees who had fled from the Ottomans. So it's safe to say that you're arriving at a volatile time, and there's all sorts of stereotypes about these foreigners. Like the Latins and Franks are brutish, the Turks ignore their own women and grab any Greek or Italian they could find, and the Armenians are vile when they live in obscurity, and most vile in all ways when they become rich. Even other Greeks are also insulted, like those from northern Anatolia are apparently the hairiest of all people, and the smell of garlic coming from a Cypriot could make somebody dizzy. So when you make it into the city, choosing where to live could be tricky. Italians live in the north, many Jews and Muslims in the south. So it's probably a good idea just to listen out for some familiar tongues and settle down there. But finding a place can be quite easy. After all, this city used to have hundreds of thousands of people in, but when the Crusaders captured it in the Fourth Crusade, the population fell to less than 50,000. It is growing again now, but really it's just a shell of what it used to be. And Ibn Battuta would later describe the city as more of a collection of villages. However, first you'll need to find a job and to understand the currency. The gold coin is a hyperpera, which is usually worth around 24 carats. But soon the coins will become debased and prices will soar. So don't try to save up your money. However, for now at least, for one hyperpera you'll be able to get 12 silver basilica, 384 copper trachea, and below that, 768 copper assaria, which were named after the old Roman coins. But just to keep this all simple, like many travellers do, we'll stick to 16 copper trachea in a carat and 24 carats in a hyperpera. Knowing this, you could become a domestic servant and make around 8 hyperpera a year, or that's the equivalent of around 8 copper trachea a day. This may not sound like a great deal, but you may get room and food included. However, if you're a woman, expect to only get half of that salary. This sort of gender pay gap would also be true for people working in a taverna or the inns. But if you're a married woman, usually they won't be employed at all in this sort of work, so you may have to lie. But not all jobs for women are poorly paid. Like you could become a milkmaid and get 15 hyperpera a year. And by milkmaid I mean people who feed other people's children. So you'll only be employed for as long as you can feed that child at least. Otherwise, some women are doubling up jobs, so they'll work in a taverna while looking after other people's children for sometimes as much as 18 hyperpera a year. Or if you have a bit of an education, you could become a clerk for around 18 hyperpera a year as well. A translator as well will always be needed, and some people are being paid around 4.25 hyperpera per month, so 54 a year, providing you find employers. You could also even set up your own shop called an ergasterion. Rent here would change a great deal obviously, but you can find shops for as low as 3 hyperpera a year. However, most shops like blacksmiths or candlestick makers tend to be grouped together, which makes competition pretty stiff. However, if you are interested in exploiting the city's location and becoming an international merchant, well, hiring a small ship to do the short journey to Bursa can cost up to 2 hyperpera. Paying people to load up supplies may be around 1, and then there's port taxes and the likes. In total it would probably be around 5 hyperpera to take cargo from Constantinople to Bursa, just over 150 kilometers away. So you'll definitely need to have money to make money here. On the flip side though, a porter is always a constant opportunity for you. The city has ships arriving all the time, so just go to the ports and you could earn a copper coin in helping unload them. Then do a few ships a day and you have a pretty decent salary. If you're young though, find yourself a trade. Like elsewhere, you'll need to become an apprentice, sometimes for as long as 4 or even 8 years. You'll be fed and housed, plus in the future, the salaries of certain skilled professionals are going to become incredibly high. Some blacksmiths can earn from 15 all the way up to 50 hyperpera, and sometimes even more. And as this is a port city, a caulker is always in high demand as well. But regulations are high in these fields, as the government often measures the quality of goods, and you'll also be expected to swear oaths to uphold them. But if you'd like a simple life, go work on the farm of some rich landowner. You can pay 1 or 2 hyperpera a year to have enough land to work on, and then go and sell your produce. Or you can just agree to give 1/3 of your produce if you'd prefer no risks. And as the city is becoming more rural, there are opportunities within the walls. But this is the beginning of proto-capitalism, and if you're a little savvy, you could really make some cash. Let's say you become a shepherd. Well, you can offer to look after 50 sheep for 2 years. During this time, you could be entitled to a share of the profits from the sale of their products, and at the end of the contract, around 24 gold coins. Or look after 140 sheep for 3 years, and you'll get 16 gold coins per year, plus a share of the profits. If you have kids, even better. You could offer their services and in return get a chunk of gold coins and maybe even an animal or 2. Like after 5 years you'd be given a cow. These are very expensive and always a good way to make a little bit of side income, as you could sell their milk, or you could get at least 1 hyperpera for its hide when it dies. Now these arrangements are even better if you have a slave. Now remember, you'll be entering into a job market against slaves, but really, many people, even some in the lower incomes, tend to have them. As a general rule of thumb, children aged between 5 and 8 tend to be sold for around 7 gold coins, then anyone over 12 will go for around 20 hyperpera and up. But sometimes race will play a factor in this, like a Turkish slave can be bought for 21, or an Abkhazi woman 28. Many of the slaves are actually being brought in by the Genoese from their colony in the Black Sea, where they obviously buy them for a lot cheaper. There, mainly Circassians are being sold for around 14 or 15, but all sorts of races and ethnicities were being sold. Like some Hungarian men go for as low as 8, or a Bulgarian woman and her 2 children sold for 37.5. Within the city though, a shoemaker named Pagano sold his 8-year-old Russian slave for 16 hyperpera. So again, even poor shopkeepers will have them. And if you're so inclined, you can get some adults for as low as 10. Obviously you'll need to feed them, but you can maybe hire out his services on a farm, along with your kids, generate a profit and repeat. So if you don't have many morals, maybe this is something to do in the future. Otherwise, the clergy is always an option as well. You could get a starting salary of around 12 hyperpera, but rise up in the ranks and soon you'll get 28 a year. Also, along with this salary, you'll also be given land which you could sublet. But within the church there is, as there always has been, disputes over pretty much everything. The most famous of which was the period of iconoclasm. This is when people went around smashing statues and destroying the paintings of saints. Or more recently, there is hesychasm, a mystical tradition which focuses on retreating into yourself to find God, rather than in the churches and the likes. Well, there will be a religious dispute over whether or not this is a heresy, so just be careful who you listen to. Plus, you'd also need to learn a lot of the rules of the church, and this is not as straightforward as you might think, as leaders often put out contradictory teachings. For instance, you can take divorce. This is allowed even for women, but she may need to prove that her husband is mad, a criminal, or impotent for over 3 years. However, in this domain, infidelity is a bit of a grey area, as sometimes it only applies if a husband goes for a married woman. Then you have the problem that many people are just bored in your services, as many priests will complain about. In the past, apparently, the people would know more about the races in the Hippodrome than the apostles in the Bible. So rather than going through all of the schooling, maybe you could just become a fool for Christ. These people go around pretending to be mad, maybe by dragging around a dead dog, or claiming to discover relics that they had in fact buried. After this, they'd then be given a great deal of money, and you could probably charge people to touch some relic, or become a faith healer of sorts. So there's always the possibility of making a chunk of money through some little trick. Or, if you are a true believer, you could always become a hermit. The Empire has always had different levels of them, like grazers, people who lived and dined with the beasts in the field, or the stylites, who live for years on top of columns. Obviously, these are not the most well-paid jobs in this life, but you'll have your rewards in the next. If none of these jobs are for you, well, you may think that the army is always an option. But most of the money has been spent on the mercenaries mentioned before. Emperor Andronicus II has actually reduced the size of the regular army to just a few thousand. Now, if you joined the army a few decades ago, well, then you'd have been given some sort of revenue from land in return for your services. After all, the emperor was wanting people to return to Constantinople and the surrounding area, and this was a great way to do it, the pronoia system. In return, their descendants were expected to continue serving in the forces, but really, this is a complicated system, and sometimes they just didn't even bother. But by dishing out land to fighters, the emperor is at least putting an army together. Yet areas of Asia Minor in particular are being handed out to Alans and all sorts of foreigners. Your best chance to join the army in this decade, however, is to maybe wait for the following campaign, offer your services, and collect a salary. Perhaps you may be offered some land as well, but really I wouldn't recommend this option. Many soldiers have returned from the field unpaid, and at the Battle of Baphius, many of the local troops just turned around and left, angry that the foreigners were being paid more and even taking their weapons from them. Otherwise, skilled troops like crossbowmen and cavalry are becoming more important in the field, so you'll just be left as a second thought. And as for these mercenaries that the emperor is spending so much on, the Alans, for instance, are on the lower end of the pay scale, as they got around 3 hyperpera per month, while those Catalan mercenaries, well, their infantry got 8.5 a month, and their cavalry over 34 gold coins a month, so an insane amount of money. Then, even at sea, there's not much chance of employment. When the Byzantines retook the city, they employed the Gasmaloi to serve in the navy. These were the children of Latins and Greeks, and largely distrusted by both. But in the last couple of decades, the navy has just been disbanded, and the Genoese are taking on the responsibility of defending the seas. So maybe you could sell your services if you're skilled enough, and make a couple of gold coins a month, or join in campaigns when desperate. But often the sense of duty and the promise of loot is enough for most to join in. It's really very unlikely you'll get a career here, but if it's loot that you're after, you could always join the Ottomans, as many are doing. But now let's say you've taken a job in a tavern or as a servant. You've got around 8 copper trachea a day to spend, but now you'll need to find a place to stay. Luckily, some houses are being sold for a pretty reasonable price. Even in the commercial Genoese centre of Pera, houses are being sold for just 12 gold coins, so a year and a half salary. Some have even gone for less at about 6 gold coins, but obviously you get what you pay for, as a house with a garden in the same area will set you back 32. So to rent basic property, I think even half a gold coin a year could get you something in a pretty decent location. As for the houses, a lot of the old Roman buildings have just been rebuilt, or their bricks reused time and time again. So some of the old multi-story Roman buildings called insulae remain, but many now feature wooden beams, and there are more and more houses being built completely out of wood. But try to avoid these older multi-story buildings, as there are reports of people bringing their animals into their homes with them. Like one priest who lived above a poet named Utensils, lived with his many kids and a group of pigs. so the urine and waste produced was just dumped out of the window. But given the amount of wooden repairs needed and the grand rebuilding, you'll see hundreds of carpenters around the city. They go door to door offering to make repairs or produce furniture, so you too will need to furnish your new property. Most don't have beds as such. The house you're renting will probably come with some sort of permanent bench, which can be folded away, and it doubles up as a seating area during meals as well. But sometimes it can be made out of the stone wall, so a good quality quilt is essential. This will range from around 2 to 4 hyperpera. If you are interested in a bed, however, a feather one will cost around 20 hyperpera, so way out of your price range. Otherwise, a chest for all of your possessions will cost around 2 gold coins, and again this will serve some other function, so you could use it as a serving space for instance. And for a little bit of decoration, get yourself an icon. These are sort of produced en masse, and most homes will have one, so they're pretty cheap, at around 1 or 2 gold coins for a very basic one. As for kitchen utensils, a good copper pot will cost 1 hyperpera, a kettle is about the same, and a kitchen knife around 6 carats or 1/4 of a hyperpera. However, given the limited space and the room is filled with wood, I'd recommend not cooking indoors. Plus, as you won't need kitchen utensils, you can save yourself a lot of money and instead, like many people do, just eat outside. To clean yourself, soap can cost around 10 copper trachea per kilogram, plus you'll also need to clean your teeth, as dental hygiene is becoming very important. Lilac chaste tree leaves mixed with a little wine is a good whitener, and for pastes, you'll need to bake seashells with a little bit of squid. To make your breath smell nice, if you can afford it, you'll just need to use things like Arabian gum or myrrh, but of course, this will make food taste pretty bad. Or you can do what many people are doing and just chew on a flower like Christmas rose. Now when it comes to sleeping, be sure to record your dreams, as they will tell you what's to come. This practice is called oniromancy, and whole dream books have been published to make sure you know the meanings. So dreaming of a shattered bowl will mean disaster is on the horizon, dreaming of fruit means fertility, and erotic dreams, well, they could be sent by demons to test pious men and women. So many people may have some form of amulet to protect them from being led astray in the dream world. However, back to your home, you'll probably need to get some animals to help boost your income. They can live indoors, or you can even buy your own plot for just a few hyperpera. A pig costs 4 or 5 carats, a sheep is 18, while a goat is only 8 carats. A donkey is pretty cheap at about 2 or 3 hyperpera, but a mule is closer to 15, and a horse, well, that can be anywhere between 15 and 90. Also, a cow may cost around the same, at 15 hyperpera on the cheaper end. However, again, this is sort of a good time to be a businessman, as across the city, loans are being handed out for essentially free. Giovanni Scandalorius, for instance, just 3 years ago, borrowed 20 hyperpera, which needed to be paid back in 3 years. He also managed to borrow some land, and he used his money to buy his cow, and then just a couple days later, loaned a further 13 hyperpera to be paid back in a year. And he would take out one more loan to buy in tools like a plough, costing 1 hyperpera. So you too could do this and sort of set yourself up on arrival. Otherwise, an olive tree, a decent one at least, could cost around half a hyperpera, or a chicken costs around 30 copper trachea. So you can get a steady supply of eggs, and many in the empire have also taken to beekeeping as well. Meanwhile, within the home, well, the husband and wife dynamic is sort of up to you. Maybe you could follow the teachings of komnenos, who believed that women should wear veils and be segregated within the home from visiting men. This actually does happen, at least in the homes of some wealthy people, and in fact the Empress has her own section of the palace for women, but nowadays this is largely just for show. Or you could become like the poet Prodromus. Over a century ago he complained, "I have a nagging wife whose tongue wags on and on." But his wife complains about him, saying he's just too lazy around the house, and in the end, she actually takes the children away from him. So when going around the city, expect to see some women with very restrictive clothes like a face veil, or maybe some women working in tavernas. Or you could see some women take children away from their fathers, or others segregated off from visitors. Just like with divorce or icons, the city has inherited 1,000 years of conflicting views. Like going back to the dawn of Christianity here, John Chrysostom spoke against beating your wife, while Tertullian said every woman should be veiled, even the unmarried ones. and later some writers will find it strange that in England, a man and woman may kiss when greeting, even if they're not husband and wife. So what sort of relationship you want is up to you. So you've got your house sorted, but before you hit the streets, it's time to get dressed. The most basic item of clothing you'll need is kaftan, which costs around 20 carats, so pretty reasonable. As for shoes, you have an option between sandals for 2 carats and a pair of shoes for 17. Now keep in mind winters here get cold, so maybe fork out extra for shoes. And in the very cold winters, you'll need a jacket as well. The prices here depend on the furs you like, so a wolfskin jacket will set you back around 4.5 hyperpera, while a lambskin is only 1.5. Then a basic belt is needed, but often this is used to show off wealth, so maybe pay a little extra and get one for at least 1 hyperpera. But some people spend fortunes on them, as they're decorated with gold and silver, sometimes depicting the lives of saints. But most people in the city wear at least a little bit of jewellery, even if they're just made out of copper, so spend anywhere between a few copper coins and dozens of hyperpera to get a necklace and some earrings. In general though, you may notice that fashions are a little extravagant. Fashions from Persia, Arabia and the West have been mixing here for a while, and this has produced some of the weirdest hat choices for the elites. Doctors will wear a turban for instance, and so too will many people in the court. Some, like the official, Theodore Metochites, seem to go a little overboard with their turbans and make them huge. Otherwise there is the pointed, almost triangular Skadion hats, which are also popular among the elites. And then there's even a sort of mix between pointed and turban, with broad stripes donating ranks in the court. But when leaving your house, you don't really need to bring a weapon with you. In the West they do, but here it's not the case. Otherwise, in the West many people would bring a weapon with them, but here this isn't really the case. Many people just are not armed, and this could be why the Latins and Franks will call you effeminate. So now you're clothed, you can head out to the tavernas to eat and drink. Here you can spend a copper trachea to get maybe a bowl of soup. 1 copper trachea will also get you 1 pound of bread to go with that as well. A popular soup is called agiazumi, which is an onion soup and is essential for fast days. Otherwise, fish is also pretty cheap. Like for 1 copper coin, you can get 12 fresh mackerel or 8 small tuna fish. Plus caviar has long been brought into the city by the Khazars of the north and their successors. Well, for pure caviar, 1 hyperpera will get you 5 kilograms. But for a lesser quality, 3 copper trachea could also get you a kilo. You can also find a large selection of salads as well, something that the Latins will actually be puzzled by. These again will cost around 1 trachea, or probably even half a trachea. Other foods may be more expensive, like a hare costs 56 trachea, a partridge is 32, and a duck is 48. If you do have a bit of money though, you can find some odd foods around the city, like a swan which costs 128 for a whole one, but weirdly, this is actually cheaper than a goose, which will cost 150. Yet the church has banned a great number of foods, something your countrymen take pride in, as they mock the Latins for eating all sorts of wild beasts, and for even letting their dogs lick the plates. But you're also in the capital at a pretty revolutionary time for food, as the fork has made it here. Some however criticise the fork for almost going against God, as he gave you fingers to act as forks. But this new invention, although only really for the rich at the minute, will in fact change the faces of the people in the city in not too long, as your descendants will have an overbite, whereas you will not. But when making your food choices, you've got to make sure that you balance the humours, to make sure that you're fit and healthy. This also applies to when you eat food. So Theodorus Prodromus recommends hare and partridges in December, but you should avoid the melancholy cabbage. Lentils should be avoided in November, along with capers and green olives in brine. Instead, eat black olives, deer, beef, male goat, gazelle, and all game birds. As for drinks, well, wine is very popular, incredibly popular in fact. But of course, the price will change based on the region it comes from. On average, a litre of local wine will cost around 2 copper trachea. But you can pay a little more, let's say around 3 to 4 copper trachea per litre, and get wine from Crete. However, as the people are drinking more and more, the government has begun to restrict the hours that the tavernas can be open, especially on Sundays. After eating, heading out onto the streets, you may see a number of fortune tellers. Some of these actually wander the streets with bears and sell clips of the animal's hair as amulets, but the authorities are beginning to clamp down on them as well. Plus there may be a number of Roma people performing circus acts, like walking on a tightrope or standing on a moving horse. There's also snake charmers, and dancing animals are another popular sight on the streets, particularly bears, monkeys and dogs. You may even catch a glimpse of some magicians and illusionists. Plus, many people will come to the streets to gawk at giants, dwarfs, and even conjoined twins. But really, the most popular street performers are mimes. You see, the church hasn't been too keen on theatre or morality plays like in Western Europe, and mimes have sort of filled in this gap. Plus, given the many languages spoken, you can see why they are in fact popular. Some mimes have also apparently stood on the city walls and mocked any would-be invaders. Yet, even though theatre may not be booming, many novels are becoming popular, like the story of Belthandros and Chrysansa. In this story, our heroic prince fights Turkish bandits and makes it to Tarsus. There he hosts a beauty pageant and gives a wand to the most beautiful woman, the Princess of Antioch. But as soon as he does, all the women disappear and he needs to continue on his quest to actually find her. These books, however, are incredibly expensive. Like, even a small copy of the Gospels with no artwork could maybe cost around 5 hyperpera, so over half a year's salary for you. Otherwise, in terms of entertainment on your day off, you could also learn the new sport that is coming from the east, which is very similar to polo and played on fields across the city. But gambling is one of the most favoured pastime and very popular in tavernas. Here, games like backgammon, or an early version of it, will be played on every table, while even adults, including emperors, enjoy playing knucklebones. As for holidays, before we even begin, you need to understand the calendar. For starters, the year isn't actually 1303 AD anymore, it's 6811. As year 0 is actually the year of creation, not the birth of Christ. And New Year is celebrated on the 1st of September, so be careful when making plans and contracts, as December 6812 may just be a couple of months away, not over 1 year. On holidays, well, you'll actually see a lot of guilds and certain professions actually organise their own. Like the clerical students and teachers will wear masks and parade through the streets on October 25th to celebrate the Feast of the Holy Notaries. And on March 12th, the women in the textile industry celebrate the Feast of Agatha, taking part in street processions, singing, and even a weaving competition. There's actually probably close to 100 festivals in total. On the many saint days you could be expected to fast, or maybe there'll be a market, so do some revision. On market days you will see things like archery, wrestling and dances, and one of the best is actually over in Thessalonica in late October, which attracts people from across the world. French, Spaniards, Egyptians all come there to trade. Some of the major holidays are Easter or Pascha, when people will paint caustic soda onto their walls and cover floors in different types of leaves. People will also have egg duels, where you'll just try to smash your opponent's egg with your own egg. However, around this time many criminals who committed lesser crimes are released, so just be careful of thieves. Then, although Theophania or Epiphany in January is a more important festival to many, Christogena on the 25th of December has some nice traditions. The emperor will wear a wreath just like they did back in Roman times, and children will walk the street dressed as camels or donkeys asking for money. At the same time, many adults will sing hymns door to door. Plus, if you have a little extra money, invite 12 poor people to your feast on this day, as many people do. Or you can just spend your day off enjoying the city. Now, if you found a house in the centre, you're surrounded by landmarks. Like if you head to the east, you'll come to the palace, well in fact the complexes of Mangana. This was built in the 11th century and is quite the marvel. It has huge gardens, fountains and the likes, but also a public hospital. This wasn't the only hospital to care for the poor and sick. Others tended to be based in monasteries like Lips or Pantocrator. But in all of them, doctors give help for free and receive a poor wage. Like someone who applies leeches, just gets 5 hyperpera annually. But many doctors may work out of a sense of duty, or maybe just for half a year, allowing them to get money elsewhere for the remaining months. But thanks to the emperors and many rich citizens, you can go get some form of treatment. In days gone by, it was said that Anna Komnena actually ran a hospital that would treat up to 10,000 people. Or Empress Theodora, the wife of Michael, made sure that the Lips monastery would always have a women's ward. So these public hospitals have been brought back to life, and many even have a pharmacy attached, and maybe even some outpatient visits. However, not all of the treatments are the best. For instance, Andronicus I Komnenos used Nile crocodiles as an aphrodisiac, and prayer and relics still play an important role. There are of course private hospitals as well, and doctors can get 40 hyperpera a year there, plus a number of extras. Like a private doctor will get 5 hyperpera, a glass vase, and a coat to perform an abortion. A general checkup may cost 2/3 of a hyperpera, and bleeding costs 2.5. Plus, if all that fails, dying as well becomes incredibly expensive. Burials can cost 10 gold coins for a nice spot, and some wills can cost over 30, but that's largely just for the rich to care about. As for you, you can use these hospitals, and in fact many institutions in quite a decent welfare system. Monasteries will have a xenodokeion, which is a place for pilgrims and strangers to stay, and maybe a tokotrophion, which is a home for the poor, where they could be trained up in a skill sometimes. Then there's always homes for the elderly and orphans, and although these aren't as developed as before, they still function. However, one institution that hasn't really recovered is schooling. Well, schooling was never formalised, as most just found themselves a tutor. At this time, in fact, you could actually get yourself a pretty well-known scholar as a tutor, like Maximus Planudes. If you do, schooling is sort of based off the old Roman style, teaching writing and arithmetic in the early years, then rhetoric and the likes later on. But there had been a long debate over which literature to include, as the clergy spoke against many of the classics. Eventually though, the secularists won out, and students will study ancient tragedies like the Phoenician women. Then, a couple centuries ago, they founded the patriarchal school as a form of higher education. But this is pretty much gone now, and schooling is back to being completely informal. However, going back to the palace complexes, inside they have the relics of the Passion, including some of Christ's beard, the spear that stabbed him, the sponge, and a lot more. And going around the city, you'll be hard-pressed not to stumble upon some relic, even though the Latins had stolen as many as they could find. Many pilgrims from as far away as Russia actually produce guides on how best to visit them all. So move on from the palaces and head north. Here you'll see the Great Chain. Well, it'll actually be underwater now, but when invaders try to take the city, they'll lift it out of the water and ships will crash into it. From this point you can actually see the foreign settlement of Pera and the hill it's situated on. It is this hill that the Ottomans will later drag their ships over in order to bypass this chain. But I'd say go south, past Hagia and maybe call into the Hippodrome monastery. This is home to an icon painting of Mary that St. Luke himself painted, or so it is said. This icon is actually paraded before the people on certain occasions and is housed in a case surrounded by precious stones. But these churches pale in comparison to the Hagia Sophia, which will tower above everything. When the Latins ransacked the city, it is said that they invited prostitutes into this holy place and again stole many treasures. But restoration work has been done, and many still struggle to describe its beauty. Pilgrims from around the world still come to visit, and really, it just needs to be seen to be believed. After saying your prayers, go behind the Hagia Sophia, where you can see the column of Justinian. This, according to some, is over 70 meters high and can be seen from the sea. In fact, when restoring the hat on top of the emperor, acrobats needed to be used, and they swung across from the Hagia Sophia. Also in this area, there is the largest of all underground cisterns storing fresh water, the Basilica Cistern. Despite its useful function, they included artwork inside, with the heads of Medusa from pagan myth. Across the road is the Baths of Zeuxippus, but don't expect to get a bath here. In fact, public baths really became seen as a luxury during the crises of the 8th century. So most of the baths closed down and were turned into all sorts of things. These baths, for instance, for a couple centuries at least, became part prison and part silk workshop. Yet in between the column and the baths, there is the Chalk Gate, the Imperial Gate that leads to another palace complex. It is said that this palace complex once housed mechanical birds that sang with the touch of a lever, and a statue of a lion that roared. This again was a whole complex containing churches and even a barracks. From the outside these buildings are impressive, but within they're empty. The Latins stole the rod of Moses along with parts of the Holy Cross, and the emperors couldn't restore these palaces, so they've moved them to the other end of the city. So head out, and there you'll see the Hippodrome. This used to be home of chariot races that divided the city into different factions. Some of these factions had their own hooligans who would riot and even challenge the throne. But in recent years, this was home to some animal battles, lions against bulls, dogs against foxes, and that sort of thing. But today, on special occasions at least, you can still attend events, like jousting, which has been imported from the West. And along with the jousts, there will be jugglers, circus performances, and even a mass brawl, as two teams of soldiers would just fight each other. However, in general, the Hippodrome is in ruins compared to before, and people are even growing grapes around it. From the Hippodrome you can go south and see another palace, Boca Leon, but I'd say go west, along the main street called the Mezza. This is still a commercial hub, as you can find a number of shops within the colonnades and under a roof. Expect to see farmers from outside herding their livestock into the city for sale at different markets. And be careful with these animals, as sometimes they're known to go a bit wild. One bull even made his way into Hagia Sophia after being probed too much. As you continue down you'll see a number of shops, but the shops here actually come in sort of order, as traders of perfume and jewels will come closer to the centre, and then lesser trades are further away. On the way there'll also be street performers, peddlers and cats. The city has loved cats for centuries and they're very well looked after. Some people are even buried with them, and many monasteries will give food out to them. And be grateful that they are here, as the Black Death will soon arrive. Carrying along this road you'll come to a couple of forums, like Constantine's and Theodosius's. Inside both they have huge columns, but neither have a statue on top anymore, as earthquakes, winds and Latins have toppled them. One of these 5-meter high statues actually washed ashore in Italy, probably from a sunken ship, but people do not know which emperor it actually is. When the Latins did take the city, they did in fact place an emperor on top of one of these columns. The problem was, it was the living Emperor Alexius V, who was placed on the column of Theodosius and thrown off into the forum below. And the Latins did actually successfully transport other statues back home, like the 4 horses outside the Hippodrome, which will remain in Venice for centuries. The Venetians also looted the Philadelphion, the next public area you'll come to, were the Mezza Forks. From here they took the portrait of the 4 tetrarchs, so, like elsewhere, it may be best to just keep moving on through these ransacked areas, the same spots where the emperors used to travel in on their triumphs. Turning off from the Mezza, a lot of the main streets are in a bit of a grid, so take a left and head south to the harbour of Theodosius. You can look to sea and see hundreds if not thousands of ships surrounding the city, some large galleys, others just small fishing vessels waiting for a shoal of fish to pass. You'll now be in an area called Vlaanga, and here is where the Armenians, Jews and even Muslims live. The Jews here have actually been given the particularly smelly job of tanning, and in this area, along the sea wall, you can see the Jewish gate, where Jews from within the ghetto sail out. Although life inside this ghetto is far from ideal, across Europe, like in England and France, they've actually been or about to be banned from those countries, so the Byzantine Empire is a little bit more welcoming. As for the Muslims, they've been allowed to construct their own mosques. Many of these come from Turkic beyliks, friendly with the emperor, or sometimes even further afield like in Damascus. They've brought with them many scientific advances, but some aren't so successful. Like in previous years, one Muslim actually tried to fly off the Great Wall, but just fell to his death. Heading back to the Mezza you'll come to the Forum of the Ox, which, along with the Hippodrome, is the site of public executions and mob justice. There is in fact a legend behind the name of this forum. It is said that this is where people were burnt alive inside the statue of a brazen bull. But legends in this city are sometimes a little hard to believe. During the iconoclastic period, Saint Theodosia, a defender of icons, was executed here by having a ram's horn driven through her neck. And in general, punishments in the city often can be a little creative. Floggings are common, so too is having something removed from your body, like nose or maybe a hand. You could be branded on the face with your crime, or even tattooed. For instance, 2 brothers were tattooed with bad poetry on their face. And molten lead has been poured down people's mouths before. In the Navy, Christian defectors have been boiled in pitch and skinned alive in centuries gone by. And along the Mezza, you'll still see many limbs of criminals as a warning to you. As for police forces, well, there's all sorts of guards serving different functions, like the Vardariotai, which were originally Magyars from Hungary, but now their identity, well, it's a mystery, but they're probably Turkic. These will go around on festival days especially, in their red uniforms, carrying a whip to keep the crowds in check. And if you are arrested when it comes to trial, you can still expect to have a trial by ordeal. Like Emperor Michael, before he was emperor, had to go through a trial by fire, holding a red-hot metal rod. He was able to do so, and thus prove that he was loyal to his own emperor. So, if accused, you better work out a way to hold a burning hot metal rod, or you'll be executed or even blinded. These blindings could be done through gouging a hot poker or even boiling hot vinegar into your eyes, and this was a favourite punishment for challengers to the throne. Plus, one punishment you may face is possibly a life in the mines. After all, the Empire needs metals, and this is a brutal job that nobody really wants. But carry on down the Mezza, pass another forum, and now you'll notice it's becoming far less populated around here. There's still a number of churches you can visit though, like St. Andrew Salis and St. Diomedes of Jerusalem, where again you can find some relics and even the bodies of some saints. But I'd say just keep heading west, and there you'll see the Golden Gate. From here, the Byzantine emperors had fought off a number of assaults. Around 40 years ago, Michael VIII Palaiologos retook the city through this gate and led a triumphant procession. But today this gate has actually been turned into a citadel, a sort of city within a city, capable of withstanding a siege for months. And in the future, it will be said that the final Byzantine emperor actually turned to marble and lives under the gate, as a statue ready to reclaim his capital city. But although this gate has been repaired, many are just being closed off, because they're unable to garrison them or repair them. Head through this gate and the people who actually live inside it, and you'll come to the Church of St. Mary of the Spring. This is a life-giving spring, capable of bringing you back from the point of death, just like it will to Angionicus III during the civil wars of the 1320s. So it is definitely worth a visit. However, you're now outside of the city walls, and carrying along this journey, you've got a 7-kilometer walk to the furthest away gate. So again, this is a reminder that this city is huge. Outside the gates, keep your eyes open for the Emperor on his hunts in Philippotion. This is a huge imperial game reserve with a palace inside it. If you are able to catch a glimpse, you may be surprised to see the animals he's with. There's obviously birds of prey, but also cheetahs, which are becoming more and more popular as a hunting animal. The deer and gazelle in these parks provide further exotic meat into the city, to go along with imported camels and even the occasional donkey. However, there are other predatory animals out in these woods, animals which began killing the emperor's game. So Roma people were hired to deal with this problem, which they did so by using poisoned meat. But if you think seeing cheetahs out here is strange, well, keep your eyes out for leopards, and maybe if you spot the emperor, you might be able to spot him with his pet lions. These lions and leopards were actually used in battle as well. Like at the beginning of the 12th century, some peasant crusaders were ransacking the countryside. So the emperor opened the gates and let his lions and leopards attack them, but a couple of them died in the process. These lions were set loose from the gate of Blachernae, and it is here where you should re-enter the city in the new centre of power. Again, this is another complex containing a few palaces and churches, like that of Porphyrogenitus. It's worth coming here when a new heir is born, as the emperor will hold him over the balcony and declare them emperor of the world. Otherwise, this is where the English Varangians will guard their high-ranking prisoners and torture some. But just a few years ago, one guard named Harry actually helped Michael Komnenos escape. You might also be able to see diplomats that have arrived from around the world, like the Ethiopians who have travelled to meet their fellow Orthodox for centuries, or even maybe the odd Mongolian, as there are discussions over a possible alliance in the works. In fact, there's a new church called St. Mary of the Mongols. This was named in honour of the princess who married Abaka Khan of the Ilkhanate, and this albeit small church will be the only one not destroyed or converted into a mosque in later centuries. But really the church here that you should visit is Chora. Here you can see new and restored mosaics, a real example of the Palaiologan Renaissance. And come back in a few years as Theodore Metochites, the man in the large hat, will really help bring this place back to life. The same cannot be said though for Constantinople's second most important church, which you can find if you go back onto the Mezza and head east. After a while you come to the Church of the Holy Apostles. Outside of this building there is the newly constructed statue of the Archangel Michael, commemorating the recapture of the city. But inside, the ruins are once again on display. This was once home to the tombs of great emperors like Basil and Justinian, but the Crusaders had opened them up and stole whatever gold they could find. The skulls of saints like Andrew, Luke and Timothy have also vanished, and in a couple of decades the whole thing will just fall into ruin once more. But there is maybe one more church you should visit. To get there you'll need to turn north and head under the Aqueduct of Valens. This is still functioning, but not maintained. Once through, you'll come to the Pantocrator. This is the same building that once housed a public hospital, and it also housed the most famous of icons when the Venetians turned it into their headquarters. Plus, it's also the burial spot for many royals and nobles. However, I'd say come back here as knight, as a stone toad from a nearby monastery is said to come to life and clean the streets. Well, at least it did when Leo was emperor centuries ago. But now you've seen too many churches and relics, so head north into the bustling foreign quarters. Here the Venetians and other Italians buy and sell their wares, unload their produce, and set sail again. In days gone by you would have seen a number of silk weavers working around here, but now the silk industry is bigger in Italy, or among the Turks, who employed or imprisoned many Byzantine silk workers. The fact the city even had silk in the first place is a great tale, as going right the way back to the 6th century, a couple of monks travelled to China and stole silkworm eggs, and smuggled them back in a couple of bamboo canes. Maybe you can still spot some people plying their trade, but you won't hear the large bangs and crashes of silk weaving like before. You can also pay a copper coin to cross over to the other side, Pera, which is owned by the Genoese. Out of the 2 Italian cities, the emperor has maintained closer relations with Genoa, but today this is really coming at a cost. These foreigners can essentially trade for free in the empire and dominate sea travel, meaning the city is entirely dependent on them. It is in this area that the Genoese will build the famous Galata Tower, but that won't be for a while. This tower will actually go against the treaty that was signed this year, as the Genoese were not allowed to fortify this colony. But this colony will later grow and be surrounded by walls. Yet, as the government needs Genoese ships, there's really nothing that can be done about it. However, Genoese people will stay to defend the city when the Ottomans make their final assault on it. So, while here, explore the wares that come in from across the world. These Italians still dominate trade with the Levant, Egypt, and sometimes they have even been popping up in India and beyond. So expect to find many goods way out of your price range. Here you can also expect to find another Jewish community who have come in with the Venetians and Genoese. But it'll now be getting dark, so pop back on a boat, head through the streets and head home. Go to sleep. But remember to record your dreams, as they will tell you what the future will be.